The winter of 1877 had been particularly cruel to the Arizona Territory. Snow blanketed the normally arid landscape, transforming the rugged terrain into something almost unrecognizable. Mason Caldwell pulled his worn leather coat tighter around his broad shoulders as he guided his chestnut mare through the ankle-deep snow. At 47, Mason's weathered face told the story of a man who had seen more than his fair share of hardship in the unforgiving West. The Civil War had claimed his youth, cattle driving had hardened his body, and the death of his wife and son to fever 5 years prior had left a permanent hollow in his chest that no amount of whiskey could fill. He'd spent the last few years working as a ranch hand for the Hollister spread, keeping mostly to himself, speaking only when necessary, and avoiding the budding settlement of Copper Springs whenever possible. The bitter wind cut through his clothes as he followed the narrow trail that wound through the foothills of the Dragoon Mountains. He was returning from delivering a message to a neighboring ranch, a simple task that should have been completed hours ago, but the unexpected snowfall had slowed his progress considerably. Mason's blue eyes, still sharp despite the crow's feet that framed them, scanned the horizon. The sun was already beginning its descent, painting the snow-covered landscape in hues of orange and pink. He wouldn't make it back to the Hollister ranch before nightfall, a realization that made him curse under his breath. The temperatures would drop dangerously low after dark, and though he was no stranger to sleeping rough, the prospect of doing so in this weather was far from appealing. As he rounded a bend in the trail, something caught his attention: tracks in the snow that hadn't been there on his outward journey. Mason reined in his horse, his gloved hand instinctively moving to the Colt revolver holstered at his hip. The tracks were fresh, made by unshod horses, Indian ponies, most likely. While relations with some of the local tribes had improved in recent years, tensions always simmered beneath the surface. The tracks appeared to belong to a small group, maybe 3 or 4 riders, heading east toward Apache Pass. Mason was about to continue on his way when another set of tracks caught his eye: wolf tracks, a whole pack of them, following the same direction as the horse tracks. A sense of unease settled in his gut. Wolves normally kept their distance from humans, but this winter had been harsh, game was scarce, and hungry wolves were unpredictable. Something made Mason turn his horse to follow the tracks instead of continuing toward the ranch. He told himself it was merely curiosity, or perhaps the desire to warn whoever was out there about the wolf pack, but deep down, he knew it was something more. It was the same instinct that had kept him alive on the battlefield, the same gut feeling that had saved him countless times in his years roaming the frontier. As he urged his mare forward, the wind picked up, carrying with it a sound that made his blood run cold: the distant howling of wolves, not in their usual hunting call, but in the frenzied chorus that signaled they had cornered prey. Without hesitation, Mason dug his heels into his horse's flanks, urging the animal into a gallop as he followed the tracks deeper into the foothills. The sight that greeted him as he crested a small rise made him draw his revolver in one fluid motion. In a small clearing below, 2 young Apache girls, neither older than 12, were huddled against a rocky outcropping. The older one held a small knife in her trembling hand, while the younger clutched what appeared to be a bundle of firewood. Surrounding them in a semicircle were 7 timber wolves, their gaunt frames evidence of the harsh winter. The largest of the pack, a scarred gray beast with bared yellow teeth, was inching closer to the terrified children, undeterred by the older girls' desperate attempts to appear threatening. There was no sign of any adults nearby, and Mason realized with a sinking feeling that the girls had likely become separated from their group while gathering wood. Without a moment's hesitation, Mason fired a shot into the air, the sound echoing across the snow-covered landscape like thunder. The wolves flinched at the noise but didn't retreat, a testament to their desperation. The largest wolf turned its amber eyes toward Mason, a low growl rumbling from its throat. The cowboy knew he had to act fast. Sliding from his saddle, he moved forward, firing another shot into the ground near the lead wolf. "Get!" he shouted, his voice carrying in the crisp air. The wolves hesitated, caught between their hunger and their fear of the man and his thundering weapon. Mason continued his advance, placing himself between the predators and the children. He could feel the girl's eyes on his back, but he kept his focus on the wolf pack, knowing that any sign of weakness could be fatal. The standoff stretched for what felt like an eternity, the only sounds being the wolves' growls and the whistling of the wind through the rocks. Mason's finger tensed on the trigger, ready to fire if the wolves charged. Then, with startling suddenness, the lead wolf lunged forward. Mason's shot hit it squarely in the chest, dropping it to the snow. The crack of the Colt seemed to break the spell, and the remaining wolves scattered, disappearing into the gathering dusk with disappointed howls. Mason kept his gun ready as he backed toward the girls, ensuring the wolves had truly retreated before holstering his weapon. Only then did he turn to face the children, who stared at him with a mixture of fear and cautious gratitude in their dark eyes. "You girls all right?" Mason asked, keeping his voice gentle despite the adrenaline still coursing through his veins. The children didn't respond verbally, but the older girl gave a slight nod, her grip on the knife still tight. Mason didn't push for more. He understood their wariness. Relations between whites and Apache remained strained, even in territories where peace treaties had been signed. "We need to find your people before those wolves circle back," he said, gesturing in the direction the tracks had come from. "Can you show me the way to your camp?" The girls exchanged a look, having a silent conversation in the way that only siblings could. Finally, the older one pointed eastward, toward a line of scrubby juniper trees that marked the beginning of a small canyon. As darkness fell in earnest, Mason led his horse with one hand, keeping the other free to reach for his gun if needed. The girls walked a few paces ahead, occasionally glancing back as if to ensure he was still following. The younger one had begun to limp slightly, and Mason suspected she had twisted her ankle while fleeing from the wolves. Without a word, he stopped, lifted her onto his horse despite her initial resistance, and continued on foot. The temperature continued to drop, and Mason could see the older girl shivering in her thin deerskin dress. He removed his coat and draped it around her shoulders. She looked at him with surprise, but accepted the gesture with a solemn nod. They pressed on through the deepening snow, guided only by the pale light of the rising moon and the girl's knowledge of the terrain. Just as Mason was beginning to worry they had lost their way, the distinct smell of wood smoke reached his nostrils. Moments later, they emerged from a narrow ravine to see the flickering lights of an Apache encampment nestled in a sheltered hollow. The girls immediately quickened their pace, the older one calling out in her native tongue. The response was immediate. Several figures emerged from the nearest wickiups, rushing toward them with expressions of relief that quickly turned to suspicion at the sight of the white man trailing behind. Mason halted, raising his empty hands to show he meant no harm. The girls ran to meet a woman who must have been their mother, her face lined with worry that melted into joy as she embraced her daughters. The reunion was short-lived, however, as a group of warriors approached, their hands resting on weapons, their expressions guarded. Mason stood his ground, making no sudden movements as the Apache woman listened to her daughter's hurried explanation. Her dark eyes, intense and evaluating, shifted to Mason, taking in his snow-covered clothes, the horse behind him, and the Colt revolver that remained holstered at his side. The tension in the air was palpable, a powder keg that could ignite with the slightest spark. Then, to Mason's surprise, the woman stepped forward, placing herself between him and the warriors. She spoke in halting English, each word carefully chosen. "My daughters say you fight wolves. Save them." It wasn't a question, but Mason nodded anyway, uncomfortable with the sudden attention. "You welcome here tonight," she continued, gesturing toward the camp. "Too cold for journey, too dangerous." Despite his initial reluctance, Mason found himself accepting the invitation, more out of necessity than desire. The night was indeed too cold for travel, and the warmth of the encampment was a powerful lure after hours in the biting wind. He was led to a small fire on the periphery of the camp, where he was given a bowl of stew and left largely to his own devices. The warriors watched him carefully, their distrust evident, but they made no move to drive him away. As he ate, Mason observed the camp around him. It was smaller than he had expected, perhaps 20 people in total, mostly women, children, and elders. He recognized the signs of a band that had been separated from the main tribe, possibly fleeing from the reservation, or simply trying to maintain their traditional way of life away from white settlements. The woman, whose name he learned, was Nayland, approached him again after he had finished eating. Her daughters lingered behind her, the younger one peering at him with open curiosity while the older maintained a cautious distance. They were gathering wood, Nayland explained, her English improving as she grew more comfortable. Gone too long, I fear. She didn't finish the sentence, but she didn't need to. Mason understood the terror of thinking your children were lost, possibly forever. It was a pain he knew intimately. "Thank you," she said simply, and though the words were few, the weight behind them was immense. Mason nodded, unsure how to respond. Gratitude was not something he had much experience with, especially in recent years. "You sleep here," Nayland continued, indicating a small wickiup near his fire. "Tomorrow you go." Morning came with clear skies and a sun that did little to warm the frozen landscape. Mason woke before dawn, his body accustomed to the early hours of ranch work. He found his horse had been cared for, fed, and watered, a courtesy he hadn't expected. As he prepared to depart, securing his saddle and checking his supplies, he noticed the camp was already awake and bustling with activity. Women tended fires and prepared food, children carried water from a nearby stream, and men checked weapons and discussed something in low, urgent tones. It was Nayland who approached him as he was about to mount up, a small package wrapped in deerskin in her hands. "For journey," she said, offering him what turned out to be dried meat and berries. Again, Mason was caught off guard by the kindness, especially given the obvious scarcity the band was facing. "I appreciate it," he said, tucking the package into his saddlebag, "but your people need this more than I do." Nayland shook her head firmly, a hint of pride flashing in her eyes. "We pay our debts," she insisted. Mason didn't argue further, recognizing the importance of the gesture. As he mounted his horse, he noticed several of the warriors looking eastward, their expressions grim. Following their gaze, he saw nothing but the endless expanse of snow-covered hills, but their concern was palpable. "Trouble?" he asked Nayland, nodding in the direction the men were watching. She hesitated, clearly weighing how much to tell this white stranger. Finally, she sighed, her breath forming a cloud in the cold air. "Soldiers from Fort Bowie, they hunt us." The revelation didn't surprise Mason. The U.S. Army had been rounding up Apache for years, forcing them onto reservations where they faced starvation, disease, and the systematic destruction of their way of life. Those who resisted or fled were hunted down relentlessly. Looking at the small band, the elderly who could barely walk, the children who shivered in the cold, the women trying to maintain some semblance of normalcy, Mason felt a familiar anger stirring in his chest. These people weren't the bloodthirsty savages depicted in newspaper stories. They were families trying to survive in a world that was increasingly hostile to their very existence. It was a sentiment he understood all too well. "How far behind are they?" he asked, his decision already forming before the conscious thought had fully materialized. Nayland seemed surprised by his question, perhaps expecting him to leave immediately now that the connection between her people and the army had been revealed. 2 days, maybe less," she answered carefully. "We move soon. Go north to mountains." Mason nodded, his eyes scanning the surrounding terrain with a strategist's gaze, a remnant of his time as a scout during the war. "The snow will slow them down, but it'll slow you down more, especially with the young and old," he observed. "And they'll have your tracks to follow unless—" He trailed off, a plan taking shape in his mind, one that went against every instinct for self-preservation he had cultivated over the years. "Unless what?" Nayland pressed, a desperate hope creeping into her voice. Mason dismounted, his decision made. "Unless they have a different trail to follow," he said simply. The implications of his words hung in the air between them. Nalen's eyes widened slightly, the only indication of her surprise. "Why would you help?" she asked, suspicion edging back into her tone. It was a fair question, one Mason asked himself as well. He had no particular love for the Apache, no personal stake in their survival. But as he looked at Nalen's daughters, huddled together near one of the fires, he thought of his own son, taken too soon, and of the wolves that had nearly claimed these children. Perhaps it was simply that he had seen too much death already in his lifetime. "Let's just say I've never been overly fond of the U.S. Army," Mason replied with a grim smile, deliberately leaving out the complexities of his own history. "And I've got no love for men who hunt women and children." Nayland studied him for a long moment, as if trying to peer into his soul and discern his true intentions. Whatever she saw seemed to satisfy her, for she nodded once decisively. "We accept your help," she said, "but council must agree." She gestured for him to follow her to where the men of the band had gathered. Mason approached with appropriate deference, aware that his presence was barely tolerated, let alone trusted. The eldest among them, a man whose face was a map of deep lines and whose cloudy eyes suggested failing vision, listened as Nayland explained Mason's offer in their language. The council's deliberation was brief but intense, with several of the younger warriors objecting strenuously to accepting help from a white man. Mason stood silently, understanding enough from their tones and gestures to know the gist of their arguments, even if the words themselves were foreign to him. Finally, the elder raised a gnarled hand, silencing the debate. He spoke directly to Mason in broken English, his voice surprisingly strong despite his frail appearance. "Why white man help Apache? Truth now." The directness of the question demanded an equally direct answer. Mason took a deep breath, searching for words that would convey his complicated motivations. "I've seen what happens on the reservations," he said finally. "I've seen what happens to people when their freedom is taken. No one deserves that." His answer, though simple, carried the weight of personal experience. The aftermath of the war, the broken promises, the disillusionment that had driven him westward in search of something he couldn't quite name. The elder seemed to sense the unspoken history behind Mason's words, for he nodded slowly, thoughtfully. "You have lost much," he observed, with the insight of one who had witnessed generations of suffering. "Same as Apache." Before Mason could respond, the elder turned to the rest of the council, speaking rapidly in his native tongue. The discussion resumed, but with less hostility than before. Finally, a consensus was reached, and the elder turned back to Mason. "We accept help, but if betray, you die." The matter-of-fact way he delivered this promise made it all the more convincing. With the council's approval, preparations began immediately. Mason outlined his plan. He would create a false trail leading west, toward the settlements, making it appear as though the band had split up. He would ensure the trail was obvious enough to draw the soldiers' attention, giving the Apache time to move north without pursuit. It was a risky strategy, one that relied on the soldiers' eagerness to capture what they would perceive as the main group. "I'll need 2 or 3 men to come with me," Mason explained. "We'll make it look like a larger group, then circle back to join you once we've led them far enough astray." Nayland translated, and after some discussion, 3 warriors volunteered or were volunteered. Mason wasn't entirely sure which. As the camp broke down with practiced efficiency, Mason found himself working alongside people who, just hours before, would have considered him an enemy. The irony wasn't lost on him. He had spent years avoiding entanglements, keeping to himself, nursing the wounds of his past in solitude. Yet here he was, risking his life for strangers based on nothing more than a chance encounter in the snow. Perhaps he was finally going mad, or perhaps this was some form of atonement for failures he had never fully confronted. Whatever the reason, he found himself committed to seeing this through, to ensuring these people had a chance at the freedom that was rightfully theirs. Dawn had barely broken when they set out, the band splitting into two groups. The main group, led by the elder, headed north toward the mountains where they hoped to find sanctuary. Mason, along with Nayland, who had insisted on accompanying them despite her daughters being sent with the main group, and the three warriors, headed west, deliberately leaving clear tracks in the snow and occasionally breaking branches or disturbing rocks to make their passage obvious. They traveled hard throughout the day, pushing their horses as much as they dared in the difficult conditions. By nightfall, they had covered considerable ground, and Mason estimated they had created enough of a false trail to convince any pursuing soldiers that this was indeed the path the Apache had taken. They made camp in a small canyon, building a fire that was larger than was strictly prudent, but necessary for the illusion they were creating. As they huddled around the flames, the tension between Mason and the warriors was palpable. They watched him with wary eyes, their hands never far from their weapons. Only Nayland seemed somewhat at ease in his presence, though even she maintained a careful distance. "Why did you come?" Mason asked her quietly as she handed him a portion of the dried meat they had brought. "Your daughters need you." Nayland's expression hardened slightly at the question. "I come because I not trust white man," she replied honestly, "even one who saves my children." Mason couldn't fault her for her caution. In her position, he would have done the same. "And I needed to see," she continued after a pause, her gaze fixed on the dancing flames. "See if you truly help, or if words are empty like so many white men before." There was a bitterness in her voice that spoke of past betrayals, of promises broken time and again. Mason nodded, understanding all too well the cost of misplaced trust. "Fair enough," he said simply. They lapsed into silence, each lost in their own thoughts as the fire crackled and the night deepened around them. It was one of the warriors, a young man named Tarek, who finally broke the silence, asking Mason in halting English about his life before this moment. The question caught Mason off guard. He had grown unaccustomed to sharing personal details, preferring the anonymity of his solitary existence. Yet something about the firelight, the danger they faced together, and perhaps the sheer unlikelihood of their alliance loosened his tongue. Mason found himself speaking of his wife Sarah, of their son William, of the fever that had taken them both in the span of a terrible week. He spoke of his time in the war, fighting for a cause he had believed in until he saw the reality of what men could do to one another in the name of righteousness. He spoke of his disillusionment with the government he had once served, with the society that seemed intent on repeating the same mistakes under different banners. As he talked, he noticed the subtle shift in the warriors' postures, the slight softening of their expressions. They might not trust him fully, but they recognized in him a man who had also suffered at the hands of the world they were fighting against. Morning brought with it the distant but unmistakable sound of horses, many horses approaching from the east. Mason was instantly alert, signaling for silence as he crept to the edge of the canyon to peer back the way they had come. In the valley below, a column of blue-coated soldiers was visible, following their trail with determined precision. "Cavalry," he whispered as he returned to the group. "About 20 men well armed." The warriors exchanged grim looks, while Nayland's face remained impassive, though Mason could see the fear in her eyes. "They're closer than I expected," he admitted. "We need to move now." They doused the fire and mounted quickly, continuing westward at a pace that would keep them ahead of the soldiers while ensuring their tracks remained visible. For 3 days, they led the cavalry on a winding chase through increasingly difficult terrain, always staying just out of sight, leaving enough signs of their passage to keep the soldiers committed to the pursuit. Mason's knowledge of the territory proved invaluable, as did the Apache warriors' uncanny ability to read the landscape and predict the soldiers' movements. They worked together with a synergy that transcended their cultural differences, united by the common goal of protecting the band. On the 4th day, as they crested a ridge overlooking a vast expanse of scrubland, Mason called a halt. "This is far enough," he declared, pointing to the mountains visible on the northern horizon. The main group should have reached the high country by now. It's time we circled back. The plan was to double back under cover of darkness, using a route that would be difficult for the cavalry to follow, then make their way north to rejoin the band. It was risky. If the soldiers realized they had been led on a wild goose chase, they might return to their original heading and still intercept the Apache. But it was a risk they had to take. They couldn't lead the cavalry indefinitely. As they prepared to change direction, however, Tarek spotted something that changed everything: a scout, separate from the main cavalry group, watching them from a distant hill. Their deception had been discovered. "We've been made," Mason said grimly, reaching for his rifle. "We need to deal with that scout before he reports back." What followed was a tense game of cat and mouse through the rugged terrain, with Mason and Tarek stalking the scout, while Nayland and the other warriors prepared an ambush in case more soldiers appeared. Using every trick he had learned in his years as a frontiersman, Mason maneuvered through the rocks and sparse vegetation, careful to stay downwind and out of sight. The scout was good trained in frontier warfare, but Mason was better. With Tarek providing a distraction, Mason managed to get within range undetected. A single, well-placed shot from his rifle, and the scout crumpled to the ground. The sound of the shot echoed across the landscape, a signal to the cavalry that would undoubtedly bring them running. "We've got minutes, not hours," Mason warned as they regrouped. "They'll come hard now." The decision was made in an instant. They would split up. Two of the warriors would continue west, creating an obvious trail for the cavalry to follow, while Mason, Nayland, and Tarek would head north immediately to warn the band. It was a desperate strategy, but their options were limited. As they prepared to part ways, one of the warriors, a stoic man named Kitchai, who had barely spoken to Mason throughout their journey, stepped forward and offered his hand. The gesture, simple yet profound, acknowledged a respect that had been earned through shared danger and common purpose. Mason clasped the man's forearm in the warrior's grip, a silent promise passing between them. The journey north was a grueling test of endurance. They pushed their horses to the limit, stopping only when absolutely necessary, eating in the saddle and sleeping in short shifts. The terrain grew increasingly mountainous, the paths narrow and treacherous. Mason's concern grew with each passing hour. Even if they reached the band in time, would the people be able to move quickly enough to evade the cavalry if their deception failed? Nayland seemed to read his thoughts, for she rode alongside him on the second day of their northward journey, her face lined with worry but her eyes determined. "My people stronger than look," she assured him. "We survive many winters, many enemies. We survive this too." Her confidence was admirable, but Mason had seen firsthand the efficiency of the U.S. cavalry when they were determined to complete a mission. The thought of what would happen if the soldiers caught up to the band, the elderly forced to march to the reservation, the children separated from their parents, the proud warriors humiliated and possibly killed if they resisted, drove him to push harder, to ignore the ache in his bones and the exhaustion that clouded his mind. On the morning of the third day, as they navigated a narrow pass between towering rock formations, Tarek suddenly raised his hand, signaling for them to stop. Mason tensed, his hand moving to his rifle, but Tarek's next action brought relief rather than alarm. He let out a distinct bird call that was immediately answered from somewhere ahead. They had found the band, or rather, the band's sentries had found them. As they rounded a bend in the pass, they were met by a group of armed warriors who escorted them to where the people had established a temporary camp in a sheltered valley. The reunion was bittersweet. Nayland embraced her daughters with fierce joy, but the news they brought cast a shadow over the momentary happiness. The elder listened gravely as Mason explained the situation: the cavalry's pursuit, the splitting of their group, the uncertainty of whether their ruse had succeeded. When he finished, the old man nodded slowly, his clouded eyes seeming to look beyond the physical world to some unseen truth. "We knew soldiers would come," he said simply, "but now we know which way they look. This is good." The band began preparations to move deeper into the mountains. to places where horses could not easily follow, and where the Apache knowledge of the terrain would give them a critical advantage. As the camp bustled with activity, Mason found himself standing apart, suddenly unsure of his place in this unfolding drama. His plan had bought them time, but the danger was far from over. The logical course of action would be to take his leave now, to return to the Hollister Ranch and the life he had built there, however hollow it might be. Yet something kept him rooted to the spot, watching as these people who had every reason to distrust him fought with quiet dignity for their freedom and their way of life. It was Nayland who approached him as he stood lost in thought, her daughters at her side. The younger girl, Talassi, clutched a small bundle in her hands, which she offered to Mason with solemn ceremony. Inside was a beaded bracelet, simple but beautiful in its craftsmanship. "For Wolf Fighter," she said shyly, using one of the few English phrases she knew. Mason was touched by the gesture, more than he cared to admit. He slipped the bracelet onto his wrist with a nod of thanks, earning a rare smile from the child. Nayland watched the exchange with an unreadable expression, then spoke in a low voice, meant for his ears alone. "You go now. Back to your people." It was both a question and an acknowledgement that their paths were about to diverge. Mason hesitated, the answer that had seemed so clear moments ago now muddled by emotions he had thought long buried. "I should," he admitted finally. "I've done what I can here." Yet even as he spoke the words, he knew they rang hollow. The truth was, he had nowhere to return to, no one waiting for his safe arrival. The Hollister Ranch had been a place to work, to exist, but never truly a home. What kept him there was nothing more than habit and the absence of a compelling reason to be elsewhere. Now, looking at Nayland and her daughters, at the community that fought so hard to stay together against overwhelming odds, he felt the stirrings of something he had forgotten: purpose. "But I won't," he continued, his decision crystallizing as he spoke. "Not yet, not until I know you're safe." Nayland's eyes widened slightly, the only indication of her surprise. "Why?" she asked again, the same question she had posed days earlier when he first offered his help. This time, Mason had a clearer answer. "Because for the first time in a long while I'm doing something that matters," he said simply. "Something right." Nayland studied him for a long moment, then nodded, accepting his decision without further question. "Then you come with us," she said. "Into mountains." It wasn't an invitation so much as a statement of fact, and Mason found himself grateful for her matter-of-fact acceptance. The next few weeks passed in a blur of constant movement, of cold nights and weary days as the band made its way deeper into the mountain wilderness. They received word through tribal networks that the cavalry had eventually realized their deception and had returned to Fort Bowie, but no one believed the reprieve would last. Spring would bring renewed efforts to round up the renegades, as the army called them. In the meantime, they settled into a hidden valley where game was plentiful and water flowed year-round, a place known only to the Apache and hidden from white men's maps. Mason found himself integrated into the daily life of the band, teaching hunting techniques he had learned in his years on the frontier, learning in turn the Apache ways of moving silently through the forest, of reading signs in nature that he had never noticed before. The initial wariness with which he had been regarded gradually gave way to a cautious acceptance, particularly after he proved his worth during a hunting expedition that provided much-needed meat for the community. The children were the first to truly accept him, especially Talassi and her sister Istas, who would follow him around the camp, asking endless questions about the world beyond the mountains. Mason found himself telling stories he had thought forgotten, memories of places and people from his earlier life that had been buried beneath years of grief and solitude. In their eager faces, he saw echoes of his son, and while the pain of that loss would never fully heal, he found that sharing these memories brought a bittersweet comfort rather than the raw agony he had feared. Nayland observed this transformation with quiet interest. She had taken on the role of translator and cultural bridge between Mason and the rest of the band, a position that required frequent interaction. Through these daily conversations, a tentative friendship began to form, built on mutual respect and the shared experience of their journey. Mason learned that she had lost her husband 3 winters ago to a white man's bullet during a raid on their previous camp, that she had been raising her daughters alone since then, determined to keep them free from the reservations where so many of their people had perished from disease and despair. In her quiet strength, in her unwavering commitment to her children and her people, Mason recognized a kindred spirit, someone who had faced profound loss yet continued to fight for what remained. As winter gave way to spring, bringing with it new growth and warmer days, Mason found himself at a crossroads. The band would soon move to their summer hunting grounds, places even more remote and inaccessible than their current location. If he was going to return to white society, now would be the time to do so, before he ventured any deeper into Apache territory. The question weighed on him as he sat by a small creek, watching the water flow over smooth stones. He had been with these people for nearly 3 months, longer than he had intended or expected. In that time, something had shifted within him. The hollow in his chest that had been his constant companion since Sarah and William's deaths had begun to fill with something new, something he hesitated to name for fear of losing it. His contemplation was interrupted by the arrival of Nayland, who sat beside him in companionable silence for several minutes before speaking. "Council meets tonight," she said finally, "to decide summer path." Mason nodded, understanding the implication. "And I need to decide my path," he replied, watching a hawk circle lazily in the clear blue sky above. Nayland followed his gaze, her expression thoughtful. "What waits for you out there?" she asked, gesturing toward the distant horizon where the world of white settlements lay. It was a simple question, but one that cut to the heart of his dilemma. What indeed? A job at a ranch owned by someone else, a room above a saloon where he could drink away the memories, a lonely old age and an unmarked grave. Nothing, he admitted, the truth of it settling like a stone in his stomach. Nothing that matters. Nayland considered this, her dark eyes reflecting the dappled sunlight that filtered through the trees above. "Here," she said after a long pause, "you matter." The words, so plainly spoken, struck Mason with unexpected force. In the time he had spent with the band, he had done more than simply exist. He had contributed, had been needed, had made a difference in lives beyond his own. It was a feeling he had almost forgotten, this sense of belonging, of purpose. Before he could respond, Nayland continued, her voice taking on a formal quality that suggested she had given careful thought to what she was about to say. "Elder asks if you stay," she said, her eyes meeting his directly. "Not as guest, as one of people." The offer took Mason by surprise, though perhaps it shouldn't have. He had proven himself trustworthy, had shared in their hardships, had fought alongside them. Still, to be invited to join the band permanently, to be accepted as one of them despite his white skin and his past, it was more than he had dared to hope for. "What about the others?" he asked, knowing that the elder's invitation might not reflect the sentiments of everyone in the band. Nayland's lips curved in a slight smile. "Some say yes with whole heart, some say yes with half heart, none say no." It was as close to unanimous acceptance as he could realistically expect, given the history between their peoples. As the sun began its descent toward the western horizon, painting the sky in shades of gold and pink, Mason made his decision. He would stay, would follow this new path wherever it might lead, would build a life among people who had offered him something he had thought forever lost, a home. The realization brought with it a profound sense of peace, as if a burden he had carried for years had finally been set down. When he told Nayland of his choice, she nodded as though she had known all along what he would decide. "Good," she said simply, but the warmth in her eyes spoke volumes more than the single word could convey. Together, they walked back to the camp, where the council was gathering around the central fire, their faces solemn yet welcoming as Mason took his place among them. In the years that followed, Mason Caldwell became known among the Apache as Wolf Fighter, a name given to him by Tallahassee that had spread throughout the band, and eventually to other Apache groups they encountered in their seasonal migrations. He learned their language, adopted their ways, and found in their community the healing that had eluded him in the white man's world. And when, 2 winters after that fateful day in the snow, Nayland approached him with a proposal of marriage, he accepted with a joy he had thought himself incapable of feeling again. Their union, blessed by the elder in a ceremony that blended Apache traditions with elements Mason remembered from his previous life, symbolized more than just the joining of two individuals. It represented a bridge between worlds, a testament to the possibility of understanding and acceptance even in the most unlikely circumstances. The cavalry never found their hidden valley, though there were close calls over the years, times when they had to move quickly and silently to avoid detection. Mason's knowledge of white men's tactics proved invaluable during these moments of crisis, just as the Apache wisdom about living in harmony with the harsh environment sustained them through droughts, harsh winters, and other natural challenges. Together, they carved out a life of freedom in the mountains, raising Talassi and Istas alongside the 2 sons that Nayland bore him in the years after their marriage. It was not an easy existence, but it was one filled with purpose, with love, and with the fierce joy of self-determination. And on quiet evenings, as they sat around the fire with their family and their people, Mason would sometimes think back to that winter day when he had followed wolf tracks in the snow, when a chance encounter had changed the course of his life. He would look at Nayland, at the strength and grace that had first drawn him to her, at the wisdom that had allowed her to see beyond the color of his skin to the man beneath, and he would marvel at the unexpected gift she had given him, not just the repayment of a debt for saving her daughters, but the far greater gift of a second chance at life, at family, at belonging. In those moments, with the stars wheeling overhead in the vast Arizona sky and the future stretching out before them like an unwritten story, Mason Caldwell knew with absolute certainty that he had found his true home. If you like this story, please like this video, subscribe to the channel, and share your impressions of this story in the comments. To listen to the next story, click on the box on the left.